Kiwis are wanting a clearer country of origin labelling on imported pork, which makes up to 60% of pork eaten here in New Zealand. Draft government regulations for cured pork will mean that imported pig meat that has been marinated or injected in New Zealand and then appears in supermarket chillers alongside New Zealand pork with no recognition that it is produced overseas will get away with this. New Zealand Pork Chief Executive David Baines joins us now. David, I feel like we haven't come very far in the last 3 to 5 years on this issue.
Yeah, it's pretty disappointing. I think we've almost got to a really good place, but we're not there yet. The legislation is really good, but there's a really big hole in the regulations. So the regulations are yet to be confirmed. They were due to be confirmed in May, but the problem is that the regulations have been deferred as part of the COVID Act deferral. And there's also a big loophole in the regulations that, as you mentioned, imported pork that comes in and is slightly modified in some way. So it could be flavoured, or it could be moisture enhanced, or it could be marinated in some way. The way the regulations are currently phrased don't have to have any country of origin labelling on it. And we've done some research, from UMR research, and we know consumers overwhelmingly want to know where their meat is coming from.
Yeah, and so of course we're, 10 days away from an election. With all of the country of origin labelling policies that you've seen across the spectrum, where does any hope lie in being able to progress this further to ensure that pork isn't left out in the dark?
Well, it is covered to a large extent, but there's this loophole, as I say. So it covers fresh pork, which is not modified, and it covers cured pork. So that's really good, because a lot of the imported product that does come in does end up in the form of bacon or ham. But there's about 10 tonne of products per week that we strongly suspect comes in and is not cured, but it has some form of modification that might be a flavoured fresh pork steak. And that'll sit alongside a New Zealand pork steak in the cabinet. They'll both appear to be the same. We'll have a 100% New Zealand label on the New Zealand product, but the imported product has got no requirement to have any sort of labelling at all, other than the name and address of the New Zealand supplier to the retailer.
Okay, so in regards to the farming practices and environmental and animal welfare standards of these countries of imported pork, for those who haven't been following the story, how far apart are they?
Well, one of the big frustrations that our farmers have is that none of the countries who send pork to New Zealand fully comply with the welfare standards that we are meeting. So we're complying to a much higher level of welfare than any of the pork that's arriving into the country. So it's not fair, and you know, we appreciate that. We're not going to reduce the welfare levels because we believe that we want to care for our animals, but we think it's not correct for the public to be looking at the point of retail and not actually appreciating that if they're concerned about the conditions that their animals have been raised in, and they don't appreciate that the imported product is from an inferior standard.
This is one of the most frustrating parts that is in our industry, and I know that there's many frustrating parts as well. Where are you at in having those conversations? Because there's some very touchy trade deals going on around the country, and bringing up tariffs to imported pork, just as the likes of Chris Claridge has suggested with Potatoes New Zealand, it comes at a flip side to everything else we're trying to achieve in our other parts of our export commodities, David. But are your voices being heard by those trade negotiators?
Well, we're certainly getting in front of ministers, and we're certainly getting in front of officials. So they do clearly understand our point of view and our frustrations. Sadly, it doesn't appear to be impacting the regulations that apply to product that comes into New Zealand. What we would like to say is that if we have to comply for a certain standard of welfare, that standard, if it's deemed to be appropriate for New Zealand, should apply to all of the product that's being presented in front of them for purchase, not just New Zealand produced product. So frustrated about that. I guess for us, we may not get that across the line with the trade negotiators, is they've clearly explained to us that welfare is not one of the conditions when it comes to trade, so that they don't even put that on the table to talk with the other party. So what we're left to do is to talk to consumers and say that New Zealand product does comply to a higher standard, but for them to be able to choose to buy it, it needs to be obvious to them at the point of purchase that some product is from New Zealand, but more importantly, some product is not. It could be from US, or it could be from Poland or Spain or Denmark. Those are the four larger countries who've sent product to New Zealand in the last month.
And no one wants to upset a US or an EU trade deal now, do they? It's interesting, David, I was just thinking it's in comparison to our freshwater regulations, right, in regards to, say, the water usage on almond farms in California, lowering the water tables that can't put out Californian fires, freely being able to come in whilst we have strict irrigation rules and strict freshwater regulations. So where do you stop when it comes to how wonderful we are and the effects of imports affecting our country? Or is it in those particularly vulnerable parts of the industry where we don't completely supply in self-sufficiency?
Yeah, really good point. And that's something that we look at and we wonder that if we're striving to reach even higher standards of welfare and compliance for environmental factors, but we're finding, particularly in the pork sector, where we're only supplying 40% of the country's consumption of pork, why are we having to comply to such a stringent level for environmental and welfare, when none of that is imposed upon that 60%, which is being imported at a cheaper price? So we're being undercut in the market. It's put a lid on our ability to achieve more for our product from retail, because they're looking at the price of our New Zealand goods, comparing to imported, and basically holding a gun to our heads to say that if you want it to be sold on the shelves, you've got to meet this imported price level. So yeah, it's just totally unfair.
Why don't we export everything then? Or is pork still viewed as a commodity worldwide?
Well, I guess because New Zealand pork industry is very small and we have very high cost of production. So 2/3 of the cost of production of pork is in the feed. And we have a much higher cost of feed in New Zealand compared to some of those other countries I mentioned before, US, Australia, and some of the EU. Their grain cost is a lot cheaper. So they also have the advantage of scale, that their pork industries are much bigger than ours. So effectively, we can't compete on price in the export market.
David, the frustration is real, but we are talking in the light and shade of Sarah's country around things that we do love, and it is our pets. Will you be able to share with us your beloveds at home?
Well, probably sounds a wee bit strange, but I've recently just re-established a tank of tropical fish. So I'm under pressure from the family to name them. Well, I've resisted the pressure so far, but yeah, I've just sort of re-established a tropical fish tank.
Ooh, we could do that in the comments below. Name the fish for David Baines. We don't want Fishy McFishface or anything silly like that. Some good practical...
Sophisticated. I'm after something sophisticated.
Yeah, one syllable, good practical fish names. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, David. Keep up the fight, and we'll talk to you very shortly on Sarah's Country. It's David Baines, the CEO for New Zealand Pork.
This is Sarah's Country.